Hello, welcome back to this week's episode of Closed by Mo. My name is Mohammed. You can call me Mo, and if you haven't figured it out by now, this is my YouTube channel where I talk about most things real estate. I'm a real estate investor and a broker based out of New York City. Now, in this week's episode, we're going to shift gears a little bit more than what we've done over the last few weeks and talk about something that I've been involved in quite actively, especially with a few of my clients that are thinking about buying in New York City, or maybe they are actively in New York City and they just don't maybe have enough money to buy like a standalone house or a multifamily property. So what do? They sort of look at apartments. Now in New York City, apartments can either be condos or co-ops. And in most cases, co-ops typically are a little bit cheaper than condos because they're a little bit more difficult, or should I say a lot more difficult to purchase, because there's a couple of extra layers of, I would say, security that you as the buyer have to sort of go through. And of course, these things also apply to a seller because it's not as easy to sell a condo, or I'm sorry, it's not as easy to sell a co-op in New York City as it is a condo. That's why co-ops typically are priced a little bit better. Without further ado, let's jump right into why NYC co-op purchases are kind of difficult. Now, obligatory warning before I continue with the rest of the video. Yes, I know not every single New York City co-op or condo is similar to each other. Yes, co-ops can vary so much from building to building, even if they're on the same block. That is because the co-op's finances, the financials, the regulations, the house rules, the co-op board as well, also have a very big impact on how the overall transaction is going to go. I don't care if you're representing a buyer, if you are the buyer, or if you're representing the seller, or you are the seller. There are a few different layers of complexity when it comes to a co-op transaction. Now, to take a little bit of a step back, when you're purchasing a property, I don't care if it's in New York City or anywhere else, if you're purchasing a standalone building or a standalone, let's say, single family house, most of the factors or counterparties in that will be the buyer and the seller. So if the buyer and seller have a agreement in place about how the deal is going to be structured and the attorneys are okay with it and it's completely legal, then, God bless you, ready to go ahead. In a co-op, that is just not the case. In a co-op, you have the buyer, you have the seller, and you have the co-op board or the co-op's regulations, attorneys, all that fun stuff that will dictate how that transaction can and can't be approved. For example, before I actually jump into the meat of this video, if, let's say, for example, the buyer and seller are very happy with an agreed upon price, and that price is a lot lower than how much the rest of the units in that building have been selling for in that specific co-op, the co-op board might just go ahead and reject that transaction because they know that that transaction will effectively skew all their average values a little bit lower. And of course, the other owners in the property or in the co-op building are shareholders in the corporation that actually organizes and manages that building itself. So you have to always keep that in mind. There's inherently a different mindset when you're interacting with co-op transactions and co-op boards more specifically. Now, to begin our process, or to begin like the first, I would say, reason why co-op transactions in New York City are not very easy, it's the co-op approval process. And this is sort of what I was alluding to. Again, if the buyer and seller are happy with a certain amount of terms, that does not necessarily mean that the transaction is going to go through, because remember, the co-op board has to approve and sign off on the entire transaction. Now, you might argue and say, hey, Mo, there are certain instances when the board approval is not required. Absolutely. This is what we call like a no board approval unit, or like a sponsor unit. Basically, if the buyer and seller are happy and the deal structure isn't super outlandish, then the unit purchase or sale doesn't need to go through the regular board approval process. However, those are very far and few in between, because technically sponsor units are basically original shares in the corporation that have never been sold or transferred. So those are dwindling down and down as time progresses over the next few decades, right? Now, another reason why co-op transactions are not easy in New York City is just stringent financial requirements. Now, you have to understand that the co-op's mindset is basically to make sure that they're really vetting the entire buyer or the seller before that transaction goes through. Now, what do I mean by this? Again, if you're buying a standalone house in New York City and you're using a mortgage, let's say, if the bank approves your loan, you're happy as the buyer and the seller is happy with everything, then you're ready to go ahead with it, right? Doesn't matter if you have $1 million in your bank account, doesn't matter if you have $50,000 left in your bank account. If the bank approves a loan, that's it, that's all there is. However, in a co-op transaction, the co-op board or the co-op house rules may put requirements on how much cash you need to keep in reserves before you're allowed to close on the actual transaction. So even if the bank approves you, even if you as the buyer are happy with how the deal is structured, even if the seller is happy with how the deal is structured and all the attorneys are happy with everything, if the co-op board says, no, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, you don't have enough reserves in your accounts to be able to hold or meet our house rule requirements or financial requirements, then they could go ahead and completely reject that approval package overall. It has happened before. Thankfully, we didn't get into that late stage of the game, actually, because we always, at least for me, I always like to review everything before I even advise my clients on purchasing or making an offer on a co-op. What we discovered was one of the co-ops that one of my clients was interested in needed 5 years of reserves requirements in their accounts to be able to maintain the mortgage and the monthly maintenance of the co-op. 5 years of reserves, that's like a very healthy 6-figure balance that people need to keep in their account just to be able to purchase, or just to be able to have that ability to purchase that unit in the co-op building. Now you might say, well, this is crazy. Why would a co-op board need this? What's going on? But remember, these are things that are sort of voted on by the rest of the board, or like what, the board is a elected group of people within the building itself, and they may have that requirement to sort of discourage people that might not be financially savvy or might not have a certain amount of net worth. The co-op board is totally allowed to do that. They don't even have to give a specific reason as to why they rejected the application, just to give you a fair perspective on how that process goes. One other thing that sometimes makes it a little bit difficult for New York City co-op transactions is limited financing options. Now you might think, okay, there's a plethora of New York City banks that will happily lend on co-ops. That's absolutely correct. However, you have to understand that when you're buying a co-op, you're not just buying that apartment or the shares. You are basically buying into the corporation that manages that building. So if the corporation that's managing the co-op is very relaxed and is very lazy about their finances, and their finances on paper are not doing good, guess what? The bank is going to be reviewing those financials, and they're going to say, no, we don't like the way this building is being managed. We're not going to approve the loan on this. Or the bank might even review the financials, and they might realize, oh my God, most of this building is rented out over 30%, 40% to tenants, not actual owners. We're not comfortable with taking on the risk of this, financing on this property. That's why a quick hint that I give people, if you're looking at, purchasing co-ops in New York City, work with a bank that has actually already approved a unit for sale or purchase within that specific building itself, because that just makes it so much easier to get the bank across the finish line. So just one less factor to worry about. Another factor on why New York City co-op transactions just don't go as super smooth as you would like is that as a shareholder, you're going to have shareholder responsibilities when it comes to owning and managing the unit yourself, right? You're going to have maintenance charges. You're going to have assessments that you need to approve on. So one thing I advise my clients, for example, is if you notice a building or a co-op building has a lot of amenities, like that's great and all, but guess what? Those amenities need to be maintained, and because you're a shareholder, you're a part owner of all those amenities. So if your building has a swimming pool that is very rare to find in New York City, especially in a co-op building, guess what? If there's a leak in that swimming pool, or if that swimming pool needs cleaning, or if there's any kind of management or anything that's needed for that actual, any of the amenities, whether it's gym, swimming pool, patio, roof deck, whatever it is, guess what? You're paying for it in the form of special assessments that will be passed on to the shareholders, and you may not very well agree with those assessments, but you are still required to pay it, or the corporation and the co-op will come after you and your shares. Another thing as well that I sort of alluded to on why New York City co-op transactions are kind of difficult is just that the board has so much discretion on who they approve and who they reject. The board is not required to share those reasons with you, as long as it of course doesn't violate fair housing. If the board says, hey, you know what? We don't like this guy because he doesn't have 6 figures or doesn't have 5 years of reserves in his bank accounts, guess what? Tough luck. You're going to have to go find something else. They can just reject you for simply not having enough money in the bank account. Although, if you were to go and purchase a house, the bank would have already approved you. Or maybe you were already approved with the bank for the co-op transactions, but the board changed their requirements, whatever it is. A couple of other things as well that are a little bit housekeeping when it comes to why New York City co-op transactions are difficult. They often have very strict subletting and usage restrictions. And what I mean by this is when folks are buying New York City apartments, typically they have a mindset of, hey, I want to buy it for a few years and maybe sell it in a few years after that, or maybe rent it out a few years after that so I can move on to something bigger. Co-ops are very much anti-landlord for the most part. I'm not saying all the time, but for the most part, they're very much anti-landlord. Condos are a little bit more relaxed in that front. So a co-op has the mindset of they want to know who their neighbors are. They want to be able to, have the same familiar faces. They want to be able to know that the people that they're approving to live there have been vetted and are actually approved to live there. That's why they will have very strict subletting policies for the most part. It's not to say that some co-ops don't have relaxed subletting policies, but what I've encountered for the most part, co-ops will have co-ops that do have subletting policies. Usually it's restricted in the sense that you have to live there for a few years, and then you have a certain amount of time that you can rent it out, and then you have to live there again. Or they'll say, okay, you can sublet it, but you have a maximum amount of time that you can sublet it for. It doesn't matter how you sort of break it up. There's all these different creative ways that co-op boards get, because they obviously they don't want to put too many restrictions, but they also don't want unit owners to just be subletting it out just willy-nilly. But there are some buildings that have very relaxed sublet policies, but of course it's a case-by-case basis. Another thing as well that you have to keep in mind with New York City co-op transactions is that they take a long time to close. And this is a very one-off example, but this is something that left a definitely bad taste in my mouth and my client's mouth. I was representing my clients that were buyers. It took us 6 months from going under contract to closing. Mind you, in the first couple of months, we already had the financing approved, the seller was ready, my clients were ready, but the co-op board just took so long because they were in the middle of a reshuffle, and then some people were out of office, and they couldn't vote on it until all the board members were available. So it was a little bit of a runaround, but it took us 6 months and so, and that is, although it's uncommon, typically co-op transactions will take maybe on average 3 months or so, unless you have a very much organized board and the board is doesn't need all the members there to vote on the approval. For example, maybe it's a no board approval sponsor unit, or maybe it's one of those processes where the board is so small that everyone can get together and just make a vote on it. Sometimes boards will meet once a month, every month and a half, to go through all the applications. Sometimes they'll meet regularly. Sometimes they'll meet on a case-by-case basis where they'll say, we have our board meeting every single month, but if we have 2 applications pending, we're going to meet together and we're going to approve them, or we decide what we want to do with them. The other thing that I've sort of alluded to as well is obviously the maintenance and assessments. That sort of ties into the shareholder responsibilities for the new owner. You as the new owner are going to be responsible for the monthly maintenance that goes into the maintaining of the entire unit itself. Not the unit, but the building amenities and everything. So you have to keep that in mind when you're looking at buildings that say have a huge washer dryer, or like a laundry room, storage, swimming pool, backyard, like all that fun stuff is great to have. But someone's going to be paying for it, and it is the owner's responsibility to do that. So if anything were to happen with the roof swimming pool or the gym in the basement, whatever it is, guess what? The building is responsible for that. So you have to make sure you're looking at the financial of the building to make sure they have enough reserves to meet a lot of those ongoing repairs, maintenance, and big capital assessment projects. With that, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video in terms of why New York City co-op transactions are not easy. Again, they are definitely possible. However, you have to make sure you're working with the right people that are organized, that are diligent, and know how to get things moving. With that, I'll leave you guys for next week. Bye-bye.